I'm hoping that this 50-minute or so introduction, that you'll have the basic gist of it. It's just an introduction to it. There's tons of this stuff, but hopefully this will give you an idea. And if some of you have interest in this, certainly I can share more with you, or if you want to know more about it. How you understand what we're going to be talking about today is really important for your work as clinicians. So whether you like this particular way of thinking about it, that's one issue, but how you understand the way that people understand themselves and understand the world is very important, because therapy is based on that. Because therapy is the idea of how you're going to change them. So you have to know what the them is. Does that make sense? So, and sometimes we make assumptions without really being thoughtful and thinking about what is this thing I'm trying to change. So before you can adopt a theoretical perspective, you have to have an understanding is how is it that people come to be who they are, and what are they? And you have to have some answer to that question before you can have interventions. It's like saying you know the effect before the cause. This is the cause. If you were thinking about teaching two classes, one of them which was an animal psychology class, and the other one is a human psychology class, what would need to be in the human psychology class that would not need to be emphasized in the animal psychology class? Does that make sense? So if you're trying to understand the psychology of human beings, what's different about that than the psychology of animals, if anything? Some of you, if any of you are behaviorists, you may say nothing is different. Yeah. Yeah.
Human beings have more capability for rational thinking.
Okay. So I like how you said capability toward. That's good. Yes, we have the potential ability to be rational. Good. Okay. Yeah.
I'm also thinking, like, for people, we kind of need to think about how our actions influence those around us more so than animals might need to. And kind of like the responsibilities we have, like at work, or taking care of the animals, or taking care of the people in our lives.
Yes. So,
I'm thinking like the ability to self-reflect. We can think about ourselves thinking about ourselves.
The ability for us to think about us is something that we likely think is unique to people, and many of us in psychology think that that matters. The fact that we can do that and do that has an impact on the way that we interact with others or in the world. Does that make sense? Okay. Other things that you can think of that might lend to that?
Emotions, the range, having the emotional capacity to...
Sure, we might argue that the range, sure, certainly we'd say that animals have some emotion depending on the species, but maybe the range is broader, the kinds of emotions. Right, like when you think about things like betrayal. Do you think like squirrels worry about being betrayed by other squirrels?
Never know, the nuts.
They may. I don't know, again, it's the kind of thing we technically don't know, but probably not. Right, so that kind of understanding of what a behavior means is probably unique to humans and maybe some other primates. The term mind or self, we're going to use the word self, is the term that we use to kind of capture these cognitive kinds of differences. And it's often broken up into these three things. I'll just do it quickly. So one is the ability to kind of interpret the world as opposed to react to the world. So when we're presented with things, we don't necessarily just react to it. We think about it, we conceptualize it, we try to understand it. One of the examples I use in courses to explain things around like behaviors and why don't reinforcements work sometimes. Well, for humans, sometimes the reinforcements don't work because humans have the ability to give reinforcements meaning, not just whether or not they want food or don't want food. So when I was a kid, I remember for some reason my dad wanted my brother and I to learn classical music, even though he was not interested in it, but he just wanted us to learn it. So he was going to pay us. It was like $10 a song. He would put, now this is before MP3s and CDs, like put the turntable needle down if we were like, Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture, $10, like that. Okay, this was his idea, totally makes sense. And $10 back then was a lot. And quite frankly, I would do it now for $10. I absolutely would do it now. But you could have paid me $100, $1,000 a song, I wouldn't do it. $1,000 a song, I wouldn't have done it, because it didn't mean anything to me. And that's something that's important when we think about human beings, that the reinforcement could be, how could this be? Because it doesn't matter. And if it doesn't matter, the reinforcement won't work. So that's this idea that we interpret the world. We don't just, and we do react to it sometimes, of course, but we have the ability, of, like, as you said, sort of the potential towards something. We have potential towards interpretation. This was yours. Reflection on and recognize our own consciousness. So we think about what it means to be ourselves all the time. You know, we use phrases like, I'm the kind of person who, or is this how I am, or is this how I want to be, et cetera, et cetera. We don't think that other animals do that. I don't think that when Molly is going from laying on the couch to laying in the bedroom that she's considering those types. Am I the kind of basset hound that wants to be blah, blah? Maybe she does, but I don't think so. Right? I don't think she's concerned about those things. And then planning for and contemplating the future. Now, other animals do plan for the future, obviously hibernation and things like that, so that's part of adaptation. But thinking about the future in a particular way and then making, you know, behavioral or cognitive decisions toward that seems to be somewhat unique. We use this term self to explain this phenomenon. For the rest of the presentation to be meaningful at all, you have to, again, buy into the fact that this matters. If you're a strict behaviorist, it doesn't matter. They sometimes refer to this stuff as the black box. What goes on at the black box is totally useless. It doesn't matter. Our behaviors adapt to the environment. So the environment changes, our behaviors change to adapt. So if that's the case, then you believe that's totally fine. It's just, this will be interesting stuff for you to learn to know what to argue against or whatever. For the rest of us, I guess I would emphasize before we move on, except for graduate students, most of us are awake like 16 or so hours a day. I mentioned this to you guys the other day. You're probably up, probably 20 hours a day. Meaning 20 out of 24 hours a day, you spend time with the self. Meaning thinking about yourself, thinking about the world, interpreting, wondering, being confused, having you do that for 20 hours a day. So the question is, does that matter in terms of your psychology? If it does, then we have to understand how that self works. If it doesn't matter, then we don't need to worry about it. We can just think about other stuff. But the fact that we do that all day long with all kinds of things, a lot of areas of psychology think that makes a difference. Also, the psychoanalytic tradition, I've been sort of picking on behaviorists, the psychoanalytic tradition would also not dismiss this, but downplay it, because from a more traditional psychoanalytic perspective, it's your unconscious that motivates what happens with yourself. So really, you want to understand the unconscious to know what's happening in those 20 hours. So they would say, yeah, this is all good, and it's useful to know, but really the good stuff is the unconscious stuff. Before we move on, I also want to be clear, this is not personality. Self is not the same as personality. Personality may include things like characteristics and traits. It might include unconscious or automatic thoughts, those kinds of things. It might also include behavior. Usually when people talk about personality, it's a complex combination of these kinds of things. We're talking about an aspect of personality that we think affects those other things. So it's this ability to do something that we're trying to understand. And we can literally spend hours just talking about this definition, because there's all kinds of very interesting debates about that particular issue, which we'll never get to the rest of it, particularly since I'm always going off on tangents, which you probably already noticed. So we won't do that. Okay. So William James, some of you might remember, he was one of the founders of psychology. He came up with one of the sort of early ways of thinking about the self that's really been very useful, and lots of other areas have used it to differentiate between what he called the I and the me. So I is an ability. It's something you're able to do. It's being able to know things, being able to organize and interpret. It's something our brain allows us to do. It's as a verb. So the I is, I have the ability to know and understand and interpret and reflect the me, which is myself as an object, myself as a person. That's who, you know me. So there's the I know the me. He also called it your empirical self, your body, your clothes, your house. So when we're thinking about human beings, there's the me that is the person, but then there's the I that thinks about me, which also affects ultimately the me. It's almost like me, like if this is just physically, like here's me, the I is me looking at me like, oh, Jack is kind of a nice person, or he's kind of annoying, or he goes off on tangents. I'm thinking about myself. So our minds allow us to think about ourselves. If you see yourself as someone who's not capable of doing certain things, you may then not take risks to find out if you can do them. So you thinking about them, that affects the kind of person that other people see you as, and ultimately who you are. So it's the I, the ability of the mind, or that our brain allows us to do, versus the me. This is, in the language of William James, the self as the author constructs a story about me. So the I constructs a story about me. So, meaning in psychology, traditionally speaking, most models of the mind or self make assumptions about the way the self works. And these are some of the assumptions. That when the self is working, it's relatively stable, it's isolated, and it seeks rationality or logic. That's what it's supposed to do naturally speaking. And usually that's framed in kind of an adaptive way. So if you're if you think about in a particular environment, if you're going to survive in that environment, for the mind to work, it would have to be able to have an accurate representation of your world and interpret that world accurately. So there's this predilection that we're rational, that isolated, meaning that we are outside of things, that we're able to, we have the potential kind of to see objectively. Now that's, having said that, not all models in psychology believe that. The psychoanalytic models would not see us as necessarily rational, although tending towards rationality if you can understand the unconscious. But certainly today, the more common models assume that when the mind's working well, it is working within, it's logical or rational. The basic assumption of models that are based on the mind in this way is that there is a right and a wrong way to view the world. There is an empirically objective world to see and relate to, and that being rational means relating to it in that way. That there is a way to view experiences, to understand things, etc. The problem with this from other models, including dialogical self, is while that sounds really cool and it sounds really interesting that human beings could be this way, there's plenty of research on this, but even just in a very folksy way, when you actually think about human beings, and I'm not talking about crazy people, just people you would describe as normal, are we really rational? Does it seem like, if you watch someone over a period of time make decisions and try to understand things, do they seek logic or do they seek something else? And I guess that's the question. And what dialogical self theory says is that, as we get into it a little bit more, is that that's not what human beings do. It's not that we don't have the potential to think logically, but our natural inclination is not to come up with this logical, rational, objective interpretation of the world. That's not what humans do. That may be what we'd like them to do, but that's not actually how we are. So we set up psychotherapeutic models to help people based on what we perhaps in the modern world would like to see people like. But in fact, when you watch people and observe yourself over time, we don't actually seem to do that. So if we want to develop models to help people, we have to develop models that work with the way we seem to actually be, not the way we like us to. They don't act out of logic, they act out of meaning making. That what people actually do when they're trying to understand the world is they take their own experiences and things that they've gone through in their own lives, and things happen, and they try to interpret it based on that, and something that is meaningful to them based on their own experiences. Not necessarily right or wrong, but just something that makes sense to them based on their own trajectory in the world. So that's kind of the basic gist of it. Number one. So the first issue around self that we're concerned about is this logic or rational thing, and dialogical self says it is not. The other is that it's not isolated. When we think about the self, we also think about it as it relates to other people. So Aristotle wrote about it in 330 BC. This is a quote from William James. People have as many different social selves as there are distinct groups of persons about whose opinion he cares. This is really a social psych phenomenon, meaning that people really shift who they are in different circumstances, their language, their posture, their, all kinds of things. So if we're doing that, then what does that mean in terms of who you are? Sociologist Cooley, some of you might remember this from Intro Soc, if any of you took it as undergrad, the looking glass self. This is one of those things that you often, it's one of those classic things you leave with. I remember the looking glass self from sociology. So the way you view yourself is largely influenced by how the social world views you. So people see you in a certain way, and then you see yourself that way, which means the way that you view yourself is influenced by something outside of you. So when we study the self, then it becomes important to understand the social aspects of how you do that, because you don't do it in a vacuum. You don't just think about yourself outside of the world. You do it in some context that gives you ideas about yourself. In addition, the self is also discussed in relationship to other kinds of concepts like self-esteem, self-efficacy, self-awareness. All these things have to do with your ability to do something outside of you. So even though it's your esteem, it's your esteem as it relates to something else, or your efficacy as it relates to something else, or your awareness of yourself as it relates to others. So there's this idea that when we're thinking about the self, that the social aspect of self is an important thing to consider. Dialogical self says that rather than the self, the way the self working is by collecting these objective mental representations of the world, that we collect different dialogues about how to understand the world, various types of dialogues. The easiest way that I can think of to demonstrate this, and this makes it a little bit simplistic, but I think it's really useful, and I'll keep using this metaphor throughout. I'm sure there's been many times in your life where you've been in situations where you're trying to figure out how to respond to something, and you say something like, well, part of me thinks that I should go around like about it this way, but another part of me thinks, but oh God, but if I do that, then this is gonna, but if I think about it this way, then okay, but they'll be really pissed if I do that. So if I do, right, like you've kind of gone back and forth, okay. So if you can imagine that as a metaphor, dialogical self theorists say that's what the self does. That we have these different narratives about understanding the world that we call up and they dialogue with each other. And that when we're presented with things in the world, we don't just have a objective mental representation, we call forward different narratives that we go back and forth on to try to figure out what to do. These different narratives, these dialogues, represent different ways of understanding and negotiating with the world, meaning they're not necessarily consistent with each other. They may be inconsistent. So the way you understand something in one case may be very different than in another case. If you watched faculty meetings over the course of a year and watched people's energy around certain things, in one meeting they'd be like, this is ridiculous, this is totally inappropriate, blah, blah. 3 meetings later, completely different attitude about it. Okay? Now, from a cognitive behavioral perspective, you might say they're irrational, which one is it, which one is the right one? And what dialogical self would say is that each position is highlighting certain ways of looking at things and limiting other ways of looking at things. And one way highlights one way that has certain emotions carried with it. Another one highlights other emotions carried with it. And that what we do is we dialogue those things. We are not consistent. We don't have one consistent robot framework that we use. That we react differently. As I already mentioned, the different dialogues also carry feeling or emotion or perspective with them. So this isn't exactly, although there's some overlap with those of you who have studied cognitive behavioral psych, it's kind of like schemas, but one of the differences is the assumption is that the dialogues are not just cognitive ways of looking at the world, but they're perspectives that also are sort of linked to certain kinds of emotions, certain kinds of ways of experiencing the world. So like when I did that little, this is totally inappropriate, blah, blah. So that's not just a perspective. It obviously represents something in me that makes me like angry or irritated. So it's connected to emotion, or it may be connected to history or people I know or values or those kind of things. So it's like the discourses or the dialogues carry a whole experience with them. They're not just cognitive schema. They're not just thought patterns. They're like experiential patterns, if that helps. Sometimes the dialogical self is referred to as a storied or narrative self, or the society of mind. So the idea is like the mind, if you think about it, it's almost like a little mini society with different cultures weighing in to figure out, no, this is inappropriate, no, it's totally fine. You know, much like cultures do at the level of trying to determine around legislation, or, you know, that fight about what's okay or what's not okay. It's the idea that we do that internally too as we're trying to figure things out. The person that's primarily responsible for dialogical self is a guy by the name of Hubert Hermans. He's been writing about this since the early 90s. And he has an institute, the Dialogical Self Institute, and they train people in therapy and stuff. It's stuff I just started getting some of the therapy training, so it's really cool. It's exciting. And they have a lot of books and articles, which I'm catching up on. We're all catching up on that stuff. These different dialogues, there's a term they use called dialogical positioning, or they sometimes call it dialogicality. These are the ways in which the self negotiates, or the ways that different discourses talk with each other. So that's that kind of part of me thinks this, part of me thinks that. They call that positioning. It's like the mind taking different positions on itself, or in terms of interpreting. So one way it does that is internally, meaning inside of your head, or inside of our heads. Those things are called I positions that represent the multiple voices of the self. That's just the term they use, letter I meaning me. So these are positions that I have in trying to understand things. The way those I positions come about is much like other areas of psychology that conceptualize that it doesn't come from nowhere, you have to internalize it from the external world. So you are living in the world and getting ideas about the way the world is categorizing and understanding things and internalizing them. So all that way of understanding things is happening in your world, you're internalizing them, and have these different dialogues that represent different parts of your life or different parts of things that are going on. So I've been using this work a lot with masculinity and trying to understand ways in which people not only think about masculinity differently, but how their thinking about masculinity changes in different situations. So that it's not just a question that you think about it differently from you, from me, but that I think about it differently in different situations, that I shift. So in a recent project I did with this, I was looking at a group of 4 men that they have a drag theater show in Boston. Drag, you think of, if you're thinking of like male to female drag, typically speaking, drag is done where men dress up as women in a flattering way. So they're trying to look attractive. So in this kind of alternative or subversive drag, they don't do that. So they do dress up like women, but they purposely are not flattering. And then they also purposely don't necessarily mask other types of masculine kinds of things. So it kind of like messes with the audience. So they're expecting certain things and getting other things. And it makes people think a lot about what gender is and what gender means. And what was interesting about it was you could see instances where they both would, like just in a very simplistic way, sometimes say, I'm masculine, and then 2 hours later say, oh, I'm totally not masculine. So you think, well, how can they shift in one case from saying I'm masculine and then sometimes saying they're not masculine? So, and when you think about these different positions, the different positions, again, they carry certain ways of things that are going to be helpful and other kinds of things that are going to be not. So I should also say all 4 men are gay identified. And in moments where they were feeling particularly outside or in ways that were more like heteronormative or where they felt like they didn't belong, they identified as not being masculine, like not being part of the mainstream group and being part of their own group. Does that make sense? And there was a lot of power in them doing that. Like, I'm not masculine, and I don't need to be masculine. And you could hear them talk about it in ways that would make them feel more connected to each other. So the advantage to that is what?
It's a safety thing.
Yeah, say more about that, yeah.
I feel like it's protecting the self.
Yeah, absolutely. And I shouldn't say it this way, but nearly every social group that has been marginalized at some level has this experience where they're like, I'm not part of that group. I'm not in that group. I'm in my own community. I'm not in that community. And there are times when that is the feeling of that's how they feel like. The downside of that is what?
Alienation from the norm.
Yeah, you're not in that group anymore. You don't get the advantages potentially or benefits or whatever of being part of that group. Or just the exposure, the connection to being part of that group, right?
It might also be limiting to the self, because if you're saying, I'm not that, then you aren't allowing yourself to explore the aspects of that you might be.
That's exactly right, perfect. So like another example of that would be using another context. I worked with some students last year around this particular issue, 3 African American boys. But one of the conversations we had, which fits around this, and it fits around this kind of positioning, this is around race. So we were all 3 guys, very bright, not doing very well in school. So we were having conversations around it, and then we got into this really kind of deep discussion around race and stuff. And one of the kids said, well, reading and stuff like that, that's not black, so I don't do that. And that's what that is. So, and I said, what do you mean it's not black? It's like, well, that's a white thing. And I said, well, non-white people were reading before white people were, so it's not a white thing. But I know where that comes from, right? But when they're thinking about it that way, they're doing exactly what you just said, which is, I'm not like them, therefore I'm not going to do the things that they do, therefore I'm not going to benefit from it. Yeah, please.
But on the other hand, it still helps them to accept themselves.
You bet it does, absolutely, because now we don't need them. We have each other.
So it's a fail-safe, really.
Exactly. So the idea here is now, not that that's right or wrong, but that position provides some adaptation and something negative, right? And at other times, and getting back to the other example, with my, the name of their dance troupe is House of DeBus, because one of the house mother, her name was Rebecca DeBus. The House of DeBus, so they would sometimes be like, I'm not masculine. Then when they talked about their performances on stage, one of the things they talked about was how provocative and in your face they were, and how empowering that felt, and how masculine it was. So even though they were like, typically speaking, the songs they would be singing would be stereotypically feminine singers, but it wouldn't always be, so that was also kind of funny. But typically it would be, and they usually would be wearing dresses and things like that, so there were sort of symbols that were typically associated with women. But the way that they would do it was very traditionally masculine, and they described this like, when I'm on stage, and we call this peacock masculinity, where it's like they're strutting on stage, and it was like, I own this place. You people are going to pay attention to me right now, okay? And they said it was very masculine. And in that space, I am very masculine. Yeah.
Is this concept culture bound? I mean, when I say that, I mean like the idea of masculinity
Yes.
may change. I mean, it's
bet.
looked at differently from
You bet.
culture to culture.
You bet. And we're going to get there, hold on to that, because what dialogical self says is that, so we have these dialogues in our head, and so do the cultures. So what's happening is that cultures are dialoguing about what masculinity, or about whatever anything is. People are dialoguing, and we're dialoguing. So we live in a world where self is a function of, I'm trying to figure out what this means, while my little community is doing that, why the world is doing that, and there's this fluid thing that's changing all the time, just like you said. Not changing rapidly all the time, but it's moving. So it's not like a static, this is what it is, therefore that. So you're absolutely right. So I would say we wouldn't see it as culture bound, but that what it means is relative to the way cultures negotiate it. Absolutely. And from a dialogical perspective, there's not a right answer. There's just the negotiation. And that we're affected by that negotiation, and who gets to decide, because sometimes when we say it's the culture's perspective, it doesn't necessarily represent a culture. Sometimes it represents who in that culture gets to represent the culture, if that makes sense. And that's true for all cultures, actually, but some more than others. But yeah, very good point. But does that generally work as an example? So thinking about that, so the idea is that we all do that. If you watched your own behavior or recorded yourself and saw yourself as you consider different things in your life, the idea is that we don't have this kind of rational linear path that we go through, that we negotiate and try to understand different things. And much like cultures change over time, so do we in terms of the way we understand things. Yeah, please.
So the I, because initially when you said, the isolated self, with the I and the me, it appears that it is in fact influenced by outside
Absolutely.
Factors, and that could help shape that. But how would we help it? Are you going to tell us how we help?
We're going to have that conversation in just a
Okay.
second. Absolutely. I have you guys are going to do it.
Okay.
So just to make that point, we only have about 5 more, or well, I guess I'm thinking class-wise, but I want to make sure. So you probably have something to do at 1 o'clock, I imagine. So to be clear, so the basic idea of the dialogical self is that you have these internal dialogues that represent these different positions. That's sort of step 1. Step 2 is that when you are having a conversation with someone else, you're also having that back and forth with them. So when you're having conversations about things, you're kind of negotiating what things mean between you, or in a group, you're negotiating what there's that social psychology negotiation. And then there's the broader, I'm using your racial or cultural example, there's the broader culture which is doing the same thing. And you can take stuff like gender, it's such a great example, because everywhere you look there's going to be different, there's like the man channel this, or there's too many of this, or whatever, or this culture thinks this, and they're all trying to vie for our own weight on what's right. And so what we say is that's what humans do. We all try to construct and make sense of stuff. And what we need to be doing is paying more attention to the way we do that than the end product. It's the fluidity part that we need to understand, not just what's in there. It's like how it gets there. So this is a graphic that a colleague of mine made. The idea is that so if human beings are born with different biology, different characteristics, different traits, The little cogs are supposed to be representing different positions, internal positions that you have, so that's what's going on in your head. So that's happening in your head while the world is negotiating those things. So this is just supposed to be a pictorial representation of what happens. And it looks much cooler when it's not going, it's more fluid. And this is the generic symbol for masculinity. So in the presentation I was using this to represent that in addition to there being, and there's lots more detail to go with this, but I just want, obviously, just time for introduction. In addition to there being these different discourses or different dialogues and cultures, there's usually a sort of dominant discourse, one that's sort of believed to be the way things are, and then there are other discourses that challenge it. So the dominant discourse may be sort of when we say, what do you stereotypically think of when you think of X? And that's like the dominant way to think about it. And then when you actually ask, but what do you think about it? And then individuals come up with a whole bunch of other stuff. So there's always a negotiation between the dominant discourse about something, or the dominant dialogue, and other dialogues. And what happens in the sciences, unfortunately, that what we often do is we self-perpetuate the dominant dialogue by only studying it and not studying the other negotiations. So what we wind up doing is and it's not that it's not important to study the dominant way of looking at something, but as you do that more and more, people begin to believe that's the way things are instead of that's the way that we are currently viewing them. And for things like gender, that's really important because so much of that stuff does change so much over time, but of course we don't live 700 years, so you can't say, well, I remember back in 1342 I wasn't able to wear this hat because you don't have that experience. You have to read and learn about it. So that's the basic idea. So what are some implications? Let's just play around with this for a little bit. If this model has any validity, what would it mean for therapy? Like, what would you foresee yourself doing in therapy, either differently or similar to what you may already be doing? Go ahead.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm thinking when, I'm with a client and they're saying something very different from what they said last time,
Yeah.
instead of doing it as kind of a confrontation of, well, last time you were saying this,
Yes.
kind of asking more like, okay, well, what's the dialogue going on in yourself that's brought you to this new position, instead of kind of being like, okay, what's going on that you're changing?
Exactly. That's great. Because the idea that we would take the position that both of those positions likely have, just like I said, something adaptive about them and something that's not as adaptive about them. And so the idea would be helping the client see that and see in which ways thinking about it this way is useful and thinking about it this way is useful, rather than having the trajectory that there is a way, get the right one and discard the other ones. Because we think the other ones are useful for some things. Yeah, absolutely. Dr. O'Toole, you had one too? Okay.
Well,
Did she steal yours?
Totally stole.
She did?
Sorry.
Damn it.
That sometimes happens though, even within a session.
Absolutely.
Like you're just, you start the session and they're talking or discussing, and it's like by the end, their thought process has changed, and kind of maybe stopping them right then and there in the process, just to kind of clarification, have them have more dialogue, I guess, in terms of why they came up to that conclusion, because you want them to end up coming to their own conclusion at the end. But
Absolutely.
even within a session, that sometimes happens. And
Absolutely. And what you're pointing out is you're pointing out the social psychology of that. Theoretically, that happened because you were there. Right? So you also offered some different spin or different way of thinking about it, which then was able to, we might say, get at some other dialogue that they had access to but just hadn't sort of pulled up, so to speak. So your own, because you're present there too, so different. So what do you do with, let me play devil's advocate. What if the way they're presenting it is you see as being troublesome or harmful? Yeah.
It's all relative. Is it troublesome or harmful to them? It's from their perspective.
Mm-hmm.
You want to see what Jane Smith buys, see Jane Smith through Jane Smith's eyes.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to stand back and we have to help them talk it through and see if it is in fact troublesome.
Mm-hmm.
You
Yeah,
know,
absolutely. So part of it might be being open to who's this for? Is this for me or for them? So
Right,
in some
exactly.
cases you might say, okay, they don't see it in the same way I do, and that's not a problem. So that's definitely, yeah, absolutely. That's
Well, and
one way
if
around.
you are saying some harmful things, you could say like, well, what are some advantages to how you're looking at it, and what are some disadvantages? How are other ways that you might look at it? What are the advantages and disadvantages?
Absolutely, and that's
jumpstart the dialogue.
Right.
absolutely, and that's very much, when I was describing this sort of interaction with these three guys who I had a very good relationship with, I very much understood, I think, why they didn't want to engage in certain types of academic behaviors. But I personally, particularly being the chair of the psychology department that they were in, thought that their actions were not good for them. Like, I was definitely taking a position. I wasn't being open-minded about it. I wasn't like, I can see it from, but where I was is, where the open-mindedness perhaps came in is, I get why you're doing this. I understand, well, I shouldn't say I understand it, but I understand, you know, this gives you that feeling of like protection and whatever, and in a school where there had, you know, in like any school unfortunately, where there had been like racist incidents and people don't feel safe or whatever, it's totally understandable to be like, I am not part of your group, I don't want to be, I'm just trying to get out of here. Like, that makes sense. Seriously, that's what it was. They wanted to be done, they did not want to be part of this. You know, but it was okay, validating what's good about that, but what are you missing out on? What are we missing out on by you not being a part of our group? That's another part of it. What are we not learning from your perspective and whatever? Definitely. So that would be a good example of that, where it's like they're doing something that, as therapists, or what, I wasn't really in therapy with them, obviously, but something that we might see as damaging, but there's something beneficial about it. And in some ways, the psychoanalytic notion of defense mechanism, this is really what the psychoanalytic people would talk about, ego or ego development. It's really what it is. Just another term for the functioning of the ego, and Hartman and all those other folks wrote about this kind of stuff too. The difference really is that the traditional psychoanalytic perspective saw alternate discourses as defenses. So all of those were things that you kind of had to learn about to get to the true experience. Whereas we might look at those same kind of things and look at all kinds of things as having, that there's not like a positive rational thing and a bunch of negative irrational, like all of our decisions about things we're going to do in life carry anxiety or concern or whatever, because we don't know what's going to happen. We don't have I mean, if you do, then you go to Vegas and win $1 billion. Most of us can't do that, right? So, yeah. What else? We have a couple more minutes on probably other sort of therapeutic implications.
How would you deal? I work with the seriously mentally ill.
Yeah.
And as you're saying this, I'm thinking of some of my clients. And I'm thinking of not only building, as far as building a therapeutic rapport, but my idea is to have them functioning. Again, functioning in a positive way for them, not what I want.
Yeah.
If you want to live under a bridge, that's your business. Not that mine do.
Yeah, but I understand
But
you,
again,
yeah.
how to deal with these folks, you know, and with this model.
I mean, my first inclination would be like, any model that's, I mean, very language dependent can sometimes be difficult. So any model that's like you know, anything that, many models are problematic for certain aspects of that population. So sometimes what they do with this kind of thing is to think about it more behaviorally, but think about like, if the positions represented different types of behavioral adaptations, if you could identify, you know, in a more, I don't know if simplistic is the right way to say it, but concrete behavior, like this is one sort of behavioral way of adapting, this is another one, this is another one, this is another one. How do these, and then sort of the same thing, because behaviors are a type of communication also, or a type of discourse. So I think that might be one way to kind of, and I suspect probably a lot of the work that you are doing now is probably more like that anyway, concrete or behavioral. So I guess maybe the shift would be instead of saying, you know, much like you're already doing, that, you know, I'm not trying to make them do this, but by allowing people to see sort of the, you know, different ways of understanding it and how those different things might be useful, can be really liberating, particularly for that population, because they can be so used to feeling like people are, you know, on top of them or whatever. So, anyways, thanks you all for coming. I hope this was helpful for our stuff. And yeah, cool. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that was fun. Thanks a lot.